Welcome to the Informatorium, because learning is fun. Today I'm going to talk about Arthur Conan Doyle. Doyle needs almost no introduction. He's the creator of one of the most famous detectives who's ever existed, Sherlock Holmes. Holmes is a character whose popularity is very easy to see. After all, he is someone who sees life as a puzzle that's ready to be solved, which makes his creator's views even more interesting. In 1884, Doyle was quite a far cry away from being the household name he is today. He was a doctor and a struggling writer. He'd mostly had his work published in magazines, and it was a magazine that gave him his big break. The story itself was called J. Habakkuk Jepson's Statement. Very catchy tale. It told the fictional story of an armed rebellion led by a disgruntled former slave on an American merchant ship. You may have heard of it. It's called the Mary Celeste. Now, we associate that ship with mystery, but at the time there'd been very little interest in the ship, and in fact it had been found floating 12 years previously. But Doyle wove a very good story with a lot of skill, and it was taken on as fact, despite the fact that the families of the missing crew wrote a lot of very indignant letters to the editor pointing out the errors. And there were a lot of errors. Doyle gets almost everything wrong. He gets the number of the crew wrong. He gets the route, the size of the ship. But it was the tiny details that Doyle included that have become part of the strange but true mythology we associate with the Mary Celeste today. He mentions food prepared for a meal that sat in the galley, the smell of tobacco smoke, beds recently slept in. Oddly enough, he even got the spelling of the ship itself wrong. It's spelt M-A-R-Y, not M-A-R-I-E. So Doyle got an incident that was very familiar at the time, a ship lost at sea, and gave it a sinister, supernatural twist. Now, 2 years later, Doyle became absolutely fascinated with spiritualism. The movement was becoming hugely popular worldwide thanks to the Fox sisters, who Doyle met with and became away convinced that their powers were genuine. That the Fox sisters went on later to confess that their abilities were a trick did little to damage the belief of Doyle in particular, and the spiritualist movement as a whole. Doyle's interest soon became an obsession. He wrote over 20 books on the subject and embarked on speaking tours around the world. This obsession was also fueled by Doyle's son being killed in the First World War, a fate shared by so many at the time who sought to say goodbye to loved ones via mediums. In 1917, he also became the famous advocate for another claim to the supernatural. In the small town of Cottingley, Yorkshire, England, a group of young girls produced pictures of what they claimed were fairies. Criticism was not slow in coming. Photographers pointed out that shots supposedly showing fairies in motion using the long exposure of the time blurred a waterfall, but not the fairies themselves. Then there were the pins that were clearly visible in the shots, but it didn't matter. It was proof enough to Doyle that fairies were real. Like the Fox sisters, the truth was eventually revealed, albeit long after Doyle's death. Interestingly enough, the great champion of spiritualism enjoyed a firm relationship with its greatest enemy of the 1920s. Doyle struck up a friendship with the magician and escapologist Harry Houdini after seeing a show in London. Doyle believed that Houdini possessed supernatural powers, despite the great magician explaining his feats were a combination of showmanship and a grueling physical fitness regime. Their friendship was destroyed when Doyle staged a reading attempting to contact Houdini's beloved mother. But the message written by Doyle's wife was in English, a language Houdini's mother never spoke well. A huge row erupted, and they never spoke again. Houdini died 4 years later, having spent a considerable amount of time and energy toward the end of his life exposing mediums as frauds. He should know. Houdini used to include medium performances in the early versions of his act. Doyle went to his grave convinced of the validity of spiritualism in general, and the supernatural in particular. His beliefs may seem contradictory to us. A man of science who invented a character that declared, "When you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." Surely shouldn't have thought the way he did. Yet I believe Doyle shows us that our beliefs often defy logic, especially if we create a scenario where the bizarre seems perfectly logical. Isaac Newton believed in alchemy at a time when it was viewed as nonsense. General Patton believed in reincarnation. Yet, to Doyle himself, spiritualism was a science. It could be broken down and rationalised and explained logically. Perhaps by claiming rational people only believe rational things, we can simply dismiss people with odd beliefs as loonies or nutters, just as we dismiss people who do terrible things as evil. They're not like us, but maybe there are. After all, we're all human.